The envelope hit the floor of the sheriff's office like a verdict, and Florence Hawthorne stood over it with her hands shaking so badly she could barely read the words printed in ink that had already begun to blur at the edges from the wet of her fingers. "He is not coming back," she said, and her voice did not crack, which was somehow worse. "He is not coming back, and he was never going to come back, and every single thing he told me was a lie." The letter was from Randall Coe's attorney in Denver. 4 sentences, efficient, cold, and final. Randall had married a woman in Colorado 3 months prior. He wished Florence well. He hoped she understood that the arrangement between them had always been informal. He signed it with his full name, which she had always thought sounded like the name of a man who would do exactly this. Deputy Joseph Bancroft was standing near the window of the sheriff's office, where he had been sorting through warrants when Florence had burst through the door. He had not moved to stop her or to greet her. He had watched her cross the room with the wild, purposeful stride of a woman who had come to make a formal complaint, and he had seen the moment the sheriff handed her the letter that had arrived at the office because Randall Coe, in his cowardice, had not even sent it directly to her. Florence looked up. Her dark eyes found Joseph's in the quiet of that room, and for a moment the whole situation between them hung suspended, like a hawk on a thermal, neither falling nor climbing. "I have been waiting 14 months, she said, not to Joseph particularly, to the room, to God, to the dry New Mexico air coming through the cracked window. 14 months, and I kept his letters, and I turned down the Harlow brothers when they came asking, and I turned down the Delacroix man from the next county who had 500 head and a proper house, and I did all of it because Randall Coe said he was coming back to make good on his word." Joseph set down the warrants he had been holding. He said nothing. He did not say, "I am sorry." He did not say, "Men like Randall are all the same." He did not perform any of the expected ritual of consolation. He simply walked to the small iron stove in the corner of the office, checked the coffee that had been sitting there since morning, determined it was still adequately hot, and poured a cup. He set it on the edge of the desk closest to Florence without looking at her directly, and then he went back to his warrants. Florence stared at the cup for a long moment. Then she picked it up. The warmth of it against her palms was the first real thing she had felt since opening that letter. She did not know it yet, but that cup of coffee was the beginning of everything. To understand how Florence Hawthorne had come to be standing in that sheriff's office in the town of Millhaven, New Mexico Territory, in the autumn of 1882, you had to go back to the spring of the previous year, when her father, Gerald Hawthorne, had died of the fever that swept through the lower ranching communities along the Pecos River, and left behind it a trail of unpaid debts, undersized herds, and daughters without prospects. Gerald Hawthorne had been a gentle man and a poor businessman. He had loved his daughter with a ferocity that made up for nearly everything else he lacked, but love does not pay the mortgage on a struggling cattle operation. And when he died, he left Florence with 43 head of cattle, a barn that needed a new roof, a house that needed new windows, and a promissory note held by the First Territorial Bank of Santa Fe that came due within 18 months. Florence was 26 years old. She had been educated at a missionary school in Albuquerque until she was 17, after which she had come home to help her father run the ranch. She knew how to read financial ledgers, and she knew how to brand cattle, and she knew how to shoot a rifle with enough accuracy to discourage coyotes and the occasional ambitious opportunist. What she did not know was how to raise enough capital to save a failing ranch on her own in a territory where the law and the economy were both still being written by the men with the largest holdings. Randall Coe had appeared at the right moment. He was 34, broad-shouldered, and charming in the particular way of men who have learned that charm is a form of currency. He ran a moderate-sized operation in the northern part of the county and had aspirations toward expansion. He had come to Florence's ranch in May of 1881 under the pretext of inquiring about purchasing some of her father's stock, and within 3 visits he had made it abundantly clear that his interest extended beyond cattle. Florence had not been foolish. She had questioned him. She had measured him the way you measure a horse before you buy it, looking at the way he moved and what he did when he thought no one was watching. What she saw was a man who was capable of good behavior when the audience warranted it. She had mistaken capability for character. He had made her a proposal in July. He would settle the bank debt. He would combine their operations. He would return from a business trip to Denver by Christmas at the latest, and they would formalize everything properly. He had kissed her hand. He had looked her in the eyes with what she had believed was sincerity. He had ridden away north and sent her letters for 3 months that were warm and specific and full of the kind of detail that made them feel real. And then the letters had grown shorter. And then they had grown sparse. And then they had stopped. And then it was autumn of 1882, and she was standing in a sheriff's office, holding a cup of coffee poured by a man she barely knew. And the betrayal was so complete, it had gone all the way around and become something almost peaceful in its totality. Joseph Bancroft had been the deputy of Millhaven for 2 years when Florence Hawthorne came into his orbit. He was 30 years old, tall in the manner of men who have done physical labor their entire lives, and he had a face that was not conventionally handsome, but was the kind of face that became more interesting the longer you looked at it. He had a quality of stillness that people in Millhaven often mistook for slowness, which was their mistake, and one he never bothered to correct. He had grown up in the Texas Panhandle, the second of 4 children of a schoolteacher mother and a father who had worked the cattle drives out of Abilene before a kicked leg had ended his driving days, and sent him into shopkeeping with the stoic resignation of a man who has learned that life adjusts your plans without asking permission. Joseph had inherited his mother's intelligence and his father's quiet, and he had made his way to New Mexico by a route that had included 2 years of ranch work, 1 year driving freight wagons, and a winter spent as a surveyor's assistant that had given him a precise and methodical relationship with the world that most people around him found either reassuring or disconcerting, depending on their character. He had come to Millhaven because Sheriff Aldous Garrett had been looking for a deputy with a steady hand and no history of trouble, and Joseph had both. He was good at his job in the way that careful, observant people are good at things that require patience over speed. He noticed what others missed. He remembered what others forgot. He did not make promises he did not intend to keep, because he found the whole practice of casual promising to be a form of dishonesty that he had very little patience for. He had noticed Florence Hawthorne before the day she came into the office with the letter. He had noticed her the previous winter when she had come in to renew the grazing permits for her land. She had sat across from Sheriff Garrett at the desk and gone through the paperwork with a focused attention that Joseph found unusual, because most people who came in for permits treated the process as a nuisance and the paperwork as an obstacle. Florence treated it as information. She read everything. She asked a clarifying question about one of the water rights clauses that actually caught Garrett off guard, and Joseph had watched from across the room and quietly revised his estimation of her upward. He had noticed her 3 months later when she had ridden into town on a morning when the spring wind was sharp and cold, tied her horse with the quick, competent nod of someone who has done it 10,000 times, and gone into the general store. He had noticed because she walked like a woman who had somewhere to be and enough confidence to get there, without requiring anyone's assistance or permission. And he had noticed, without meaning to, because noticing people was simply what he did. He had not made any particular effort to know her. That was not his way. He was not the sort of man who introduced himself to women he found interesting and offered to be helpful in ways that were transparent in their motivation. He simply existed in the same small town, and he watched, and he formed his own quiet opinion of Florence Hawthorne, and he kept it entirely to himself. The morning after the letter, Florence came back to the sheriff's office. This time she came to file a formal inquiry about the status of the promissory note, and whether Randall Coe's failure to honor their arrangement constituted any form of legal breach she could pursue. Sheriff Garrett was sympathetic but direct. Without a written contract, she had very little recourse. Their arrangement had been conducted on verbal agreement and personal letters, none of which constituted enforceable obligation under territorial law. Florence took this information the way she took most bad information, which was to absorb it fully, say nothing until she had processed it, and then ask the most practical follow-up question available to her. "If I cannot pursue him legally," she said, "then I need to find another solution for the bank debt. Who in this county is currently looking to buy grazing rights or additional acreage?" Garrett scratched his chin. Joseph, who was at the back of the room cleaning his rifle with the methodical focus he brought to all maintenance tasks, did not look up, but he spoke. "Harlow Brothers have been looking to expand their South Pasture operation," he said. "There is also a man named Everett Marsh who came through last month looking for water access. Your land sits above the creek. He would pay well for access rights without you needing to sell the acreage." Both Florence and Garrett looked at him. "You remember that," Garrett said, which was not really a question. "I remember most things," Joseph said, which was not a boast. He looked at Florence. "If you want, I can write down the names and the details I know. You can follow up on your own." "I would appreciate that," Florence said. He wrote it down. He gave it to her. She left. That was the second thing. After the coffee, the list of names. Small, practical, useful. No drama attached. No expectation of gratitude. No performance of helpfulness designed to make her feel obligated or impressed. Just information, offered because it was needed. Florence thought about it on the ride home. She had been thinking about a great many things on a great many rides home over the past 14 months. She had thought about Randall Co. and the nature of promises, and the specific stupidity of having trusted a man whose primary qualification was that he had shown up at the right moment with a pleasant enough face and the right words. She had thought about the ranch and the debt and the 43 head of cattle that were not going to reproduce fast enough to solve her financial problem on any timeline the bank would honor. She had thought about what it meant to be a woman alone on a piece of land in a territory that was still deciding what it believed about women alone on pieces of land. She had not, until recently, thought very much about Joseph Bancroft. She began to think about him now. She did not think about him romantically. That seemed both premature and beside the point given the circumstances. What she thought about was the quality of his presence, which was different from every other man she had encountered in the 14 months of waiting for Randall Co. to either materialize or disappear. Every rancher, every merchant, every attorney, every well-meaning neighbor who had come to her ranch with advice or proposals or condolences had brought with them a current of wanting. They wanted something from her, whether it was the land or the company or the simple satisfaction of being seen as useful. Even the kindest of them had an angle, a hidden motive wrapped in neighborly concern. Joseph Bancroft had poured her a cup of coffee and gone back to work. He had given her a list of names because she needed it. He had made her no promises. He had offered her no elevated vision of what he might become to her. He had simply been there, quiet and capable, and had done what the moment required. It was, she realized, the most honest interaction she had had with a man in longer than she could clearly remember. The following week she went to see the man named Everett Marsh, whose information she had gotten from Joseph's list. Marsh was a taciturn cattle broker from Arizona who had come to the territory looking for reliable water access for a summer grazing operation he was planning. He did not waste her time with small talk. Within an hour they had worked out the terms of a water access lease that would bring Florence enough money to make 3 months of payments on the banknote and give her room to think. She rode back through Millhaven on her way home and stopped at the office without fully planning to. Joseph was alone inside. Garrett was out on some errand. Joseph was at his desk writing something in the neat, deliberate hand that she would later come to recognize as characteristic of him. Everything he put on paper careful and considered, never a wasted word. "The Marsh meeting went well," she said. He looked up. "Good," he said. "Your information was accurate," she said. "He offered exactly what you described him as likely to offer." "He struck me as a straightforward man," Joseph said. Florence sat down in the chair across from his desk, which she had not done before. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at him with the direct, measuring attention that was her natural mode of observation. "Why did you remember all of that?" she asked. "The information about the land buyers and the water access. What made you keep that?" Joseph considered the question for a moment, not as if he found it intrusive, but as if he was actually thinking about the honest answer. "I remember details because details matter," he said. "Most people treat information as temporary. They hear something and they let it go because they do not expect to need it. I have found it more useful to keep things." "You keep a great deal then," Florence said. "What is worth keeping?" he said. She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly conversational. Then she said, "Thank you for the list," and stood up and left. That night she sat on her porch in the cooling dark of a New Mexico autumn evening and thought about Joseph Bancroft's hands writing on paper, and the quality of careful attention he gave to everything he did, and the fact that she had gone into his office without a clear reason for being there, and had not entirely minded the time she had spent. October in Millhaven arrived with the dry cold that comes to the high desert like a change in personality, sudden and clarifying. Florence had begun to feel, in the weeks since the Marsh agreement, a tentative returning of something she had almost forgotten she had, which was the capacity to make plans without the shadow of Randall Coe's absent promise darkening every calculation. She began to think about the winter herd and the spring calving and a repair to the north fence that had been deferred for too long. She began to think about the future in practical, forward terms, which was a relief after so many months of suspended waiting. She also began, without quite deciding to find reasons to pass through Millhaven with slightly more regularity than strictly necessary. She told herself this was practical. The sheriff's office was a useful resource. Joseph Bancroft's memory for territorial details had already proven itself valuable. There was no reason not to take advantage of an available resource. This was sound management of limited assets. She did not examine this reasoning very closely. The first time she understood something was shifting happened in late October. She had come into town for supplies and had stopped at the office, and Joseph was not there. Garrett was, and she had a brief conversation with him about a boundary dispute with her neighbor to the east, a man named Caleb Prout who had been moving the corner markers of their shared fence line incrementally westward over the past 2 grazing seasons. "That is a pattern," Garrett said, frowning. "Not enough movement each time to be definitive, but enough accumulated to matter." "Enough accumulated to matter," Florence repeated. "Yes, that is exactly right." "I will have a word with Prout," Garrett said. Florence was nodding at this when the door opened and Joseph came in carrying a paper-wrapped parcel and a leather bag that turned out to contain, when he set it on the desk, several medical supplies. She gave him a questioning look. "Mrs. Albrecht's youngest fell off the fence at the schoolyard," he said, answering the look without being asked to explain it. "The school has nothing adequate for a cut that deep. I went to the pharmacy." Garrett stared at him. "You paid for that yourself." "It was not expensive," Joseph said. "That is not the point," Garrett said. Joseph did not argue with this. He simply began sorting the supplies, which told Florence that he agreed it was not the point, and that the point had not changed his behavior, and that he was not interested in discussing it further. She watched him do this. She watched his hands, which were careful and sure. She watched the way he organized the medical items in order of likely usefulness. She watched him not look for any acknowledgement from either her or Garrett. Something settled in her chest. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was the specific discomfort of beginning to care about someone you had not budgeted for. She rode home in a state of notable internal disruption and spent the evening trying to read a farming almanac and failing. The boundary dispute with Caleb Prout escalated in November in the way of slow-moving things that suddenly lurch into motion. Prout was a man of 50 with a large operation, and a personality that had been shaped entirely by decades of getting what he wanted through persistence and selective memory about where his property ended and other people's began. He had 3 ranch hands who took their cues from him, and when Garrett rode out to have his conversation with Prout, Prout received it with the particular kind of affected innocence that is itself a form of aggression. 2 weeks later, Florence found 3 of her cattle on the wrong side of a fence line that had unambiguously been moved overnight. She rode to town. Garrett was in the office and so was Joseph. She explained what had happened with the flat precision she brought to things that made her angry, all the emotion gone underground and replaced by specificity. "He is testing what I will do," she said. "He has been doing it slowly enough that each individual incident looks like an accident, but the accumulation is a pattern and the pattern is intentional." "We need documentation," Joseph said. He had been quiet through her explanation, and now he said this with the authority of a man who has already been thinking through the problem while listening. "What kind of documentation?" Florence asked. "Survey marks," he said. "Independent, dated, witnessed. If we establish the current accurate position of the boundary with a proper survey, any future movement becomes indefensible, and a survey record creates a baseline that any judge in the territory would recognize." Garrett nodded. "That is sound, but surveyors cost money, Florence." "I know one," Joseph said. "Tom Ray's. He owes me a favor and he does good work. I can ask him to come out in the next 2 weeks if you want." Florence looked at him. "You would do that?" "I said I would ask," Joseph said. "He may or may not be available." This was, she was learning, a characteristic distinction he made. He would do what he could do. He would not promise what he could not guarantee. Every offer he made was precisely calibrated to what was actually in his power to deliver. "Ask him," Florence said. "Please." Tom Ray's came out on the 15th of November. He was a compact, efficient Mexican-American man in his 40s, with a surveyor's instinct for the horizontal that expressed itself as a general skepticism about everything that was not level or plumb. He surveyed the boundary line between Florence's property and Prout's with the exacting thoroughness of someone who understood that imprecision would be used against the results later. Joseph was present throughout, not to supervise, but because he had arranged the survey and felt a practical responsibility for seeing it done correctly. Florence walked the line with them. She watched Joseph and Tom Ray's work together, the 2 of them communicating in the shorthand of men who understand a task, and she felt herself relax in the particular way that competence in others can produce in someone who has been carrying too much alone for too long. At noon, she produced a cloth-wrapped lunch she had brought from the ranch, bread and hard cheese and dried beef and 2 apples, enough for 3 people. She spread it on a flat rock near the fence line and said nothing, just opened it in a way that made it clear everyone was welcome to it. Tom Ray's ate appreciatively and talked about a survey he had done in Lincoln County the previous year that had resolved a water dispute that had nearly turned into something worse. Joseph ate quietly and thanked her with a look rather than words. Florence ate her apple and looked at the land she had grown up on and felt, for the first time in a long time, something that was almost optimism. "Your father was Gerald Hawthorne," Tom Ray's said as they were packing up the equipment. "Yes," Florence said. "I knew him a little," Ray's said. "He came to a town meeting about the Pecos water allocation in '78. He spoke very clearly about what was fair and what was not. Not many men there agreed with him, but he was right, and eventually that showed." Florence was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like him," she said. She glanced at Joseph. He was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read, which was soft at the edges in a way his face usually was not. She looked away before either of them could find a word for what was passing between them. The survey results were filed with the county records in early December. They established the boundary line with precise legal clarity. When Caleb Prout received a formal letter from Sheriff Garrett citing the survey results and noting that any future displacement of boundary markers would be treated as deliberate trespass and prosecuted accordingly. He was silent for 3 days. Then he sent a ranch hand over to reset the markers he had moved to their correct positions, without any acknowledgement of what he was doing or why. Florence received this news standing on her porch in the early December cold, and she put her hand over her mouth and breathed out through her nose, and felt the specific relief of a threat neutralized through patience and proper procedure, rather than confrontation. She drove her wagon into town the next day. She brought a pie. This was not, she told herself, symbolic. It was a practical expression of appreciation for services rendered. It was a normal thing that people did. She brought it to the sheriff's office. Garrett was delighted. Joseph accepted a piece with quiet thanks and ate it with the focused appreciation of someone who does not have access to much home cooking, and does not make a theatrical production of appreciating it when it appears, but does actually appreciate it. "Prut will not give you further trouble," Joseph said when he had finished his piece. "Men like him respond to clear lines." He moved it in the first place because the situation was ambiguous. Now it is not. "You knew that from the beginning," Florence said. "That documentation was the solution." "It was the most sustainable solution," he said. "There are faster ways to handle boundary disputes in the territory. Most of them create new problems." Florence thought about this. She thought about the hidden motives of faster solutions, the ones that involved threats or confrontations or the kind of masculine performance that solved the immediate problem while poisoning the well for every future interaction. "You think ahead," she said. "It is useful," he said. "It is more than useful," she said. "It is rare." He looked at her. His eyes were a particular shade of brown that she had noticed without meaning to, steady and clear like deep water in good light. "Thank you for the pie," he said. "Thank you for Tom Ray's," she said. She left before either of them said anything else, and rode home with her face into the cold December wind and a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. Christmas in Millhaven in 1882 was modest the way frontier Christmases generally were, which is to say, it was made meaningful by effort rather than abundance. The town had a small church that the circuit preacher visited on a rotating schedule, and several of the ladies had organized a community gathering at the general store for the 24th that involved a great deal of food preparation, and the collective decoration of a pine tree that 3 of the younger boys had hauled in from the foothills. Florence went. She had not originally intended to, preferring the quiet of her own ranch to the complicated social navigation of a gathering where people would ask about Randall Co., or carefully not ask about Randall Co. in ways that were worse. But Mrs. Albrecht, whose son Joseph had helped in October, had specifically invited her, and Florence found it difficult to refuse a specific invitation from a woman whose warmth was entirely uncalculated. Joseph was there because Garrett had asked him to be present in a loose official capacity, which mostly meant he stood near the door and periodically checked on the horses outside, and was available in case. The evening celebrations produced the kind of dispute that small-town gatherings occasionally generate when people have been inside for several months, and the whiskey has been circulating. Florence arrived and accepted a cup of cider from Mrs. Albrecht and positioned herself near the bookshelf at the back of the room, which was both comfortable and defensible. She watched the room with the observational patience she brought to most social situations, and thought that it was actually rather pleasant, the gathering, and that she had been unfair to herself in anticipating it badly. Joseph appeared beside her at some point in the second hour. He had not crossed the room with any obvious purpose. He was simply present, as he tended to be, appearing in spaces without announcement. "Are you finding it tolerable?" he asked. "I am finding it better than I expected," she said. "I expected it to be worse." "You came prepared to be miserable and instead you are only moderately uncomfortable," he said. "This counts as a success." She looked at him. "Was that a joke?" "Approximately," he said. She laughed. It surprised her. It was not the polite social laugh she had been deploying carefully all evening, but an actual laugh, quick and genuine, and it surprised her enough that she looked away from him for a moment to collect herself. When she looked back, he was watching her with that expression again, the one that was softer than his usual careful neutral. "What did you do before Millhaven?" she asked. She had been wondering this and had not yet found a natural opening to ask. "Ranch work, freight. A winter with a surveying company in New Mexico territory, which is probably why I knew about Tom Ray's. And before that, Texas," he said. "I grew up in the Panhandle. My mother taught school." "That explains the handwriting," Florence said. "She would be glad to know it produced something," he said. They stood in a comfortable quiet for a moment. Near the front of the room, someone had begun to play a fiddle, something slow and sweet, and several couples had moved to the cleared space near the tree to dance. "Do you dance?" Florence asked, which she had not planned to ask. He looked at her with a careful attention that suggested he understood the layers in the question. "I know how," he said. "Whether I do on a given occasion depends on whether there is someone worth dancing with." The sentence landed between them with a precise weight. "That is a complicated answer," she said. "Most honest answers are," he said. They did not dance that night. They stood near the bookshelf and talked about the territory and about her father's ranch, and about a novel she had on her shelf at home that he had apparently also read. And it was the most sustained conversation they had ever had. And it was easy in a way that conversations had not been easy for Florence in a very long time. When she left at 9 o'clock to make the ride home before the cold deepened into something genuinely dangerous, he walked her to her wagon and held the horse's head while she climbed up, which was practical and courteous and nothing more. And she drove away into the dark with the fiddle music fading behind her, and a feeling in her chest that she had stopped trying to categorize. January was hard on the territory in the way that the high desert winter occasionally decides to be, with a January storm that dropped enough snow to close the mountain passes and strand travelers, and test the strength of every structure that had been built with more optimism than engineering. Florence spent 4 days doing nothing but keeping her animals alive and her pipes from freezing and her firewood supply from reaching zero. On the 5th day, when the storm broke and the landscape opened up into the blinding white clarity that follows a New Mexico blizzard, she found a calf that had been born in the worst of it, alive but barely, separated from its mother in the chaos of the storm, huddled against the south wall of the barn where the wind had been weakest. She brought it inside and put it in front of her fireplace and spent the night keeping it warm with blankets and the heat of her own body against its wet side, feeding it warm water with a rag until it was stable enough to stand. In the morning it stood up, and she felt the specific exhausted joy of having saved something that was going to live. She told Joseph about it the following week when she came to town for supplies. She had not planned to. It came out naturally, the way things come out when you have been thinking about them and someone you trust is available. He listened to the whole story. When she finished, he said, "You did the right things in the right order." "I did not know I was doing the right things," she said. "I was guessing." "Good guessing is mostly experience," he said. "And you have experience." She looked at him. "You are very consistent," she said. "In what way?" "You do not tell people they are remarkable," she said. "You tell them that their actions make sense given what they know. It is more respectful, actually." He was quiet for a moment. "I had not thought about it that way," he said. "I suppose I distrust compliments that sound disconnected from the actual things someone did." "So do I," she said. They looked at each other across his desk, and something passed between them that was becoming increasingly difficult to misidentify. "Florence," he said, and the sound of her first name in his voice was careful and particular, as if he had considered whether to use it and decided this was the moment. "Yes," she said. "Would you be willing to have supper with me on Friday?" he said. "At the hotel dining room, not in any official capacity." It was not phrased as a question exactly. It was phrased as an inquiry that assumed she was capable of making an informed decision and respected that capability. "Yes," she said. I would be willing. The hotel dining room in Millhaven was not elaborate. It had 8 tables covered with white cloth that had been laundered so many times the white had gone to cream, and a kitchen that produced reliable if unadorned food, and a proprietress named Elena Vasquez who ran it with the particular authority of a woman who knows that the success of her establishment depends entirely on her own judgment, and acts accordingly. Joseph arrived before Florence and was seated when she came in. He stood when she entered, which was courteous and undemonstrative, and she sat across from him in the lamplight that made the cream tablecloths look warmer than they were. They ate beef stew and biscuits, and a dried apple dessert that Elena Vasquez made with a particular combination of spices that Florence had never been able to identify but found deeply comforting. And they talked for 2 hours in the way of people who have discovered that conversation between them moves with an ease that surprises neither of them by now. He told her about a case he had worked the previous year involving a land fraud scheme that had caught out 3 ranchers in the northern county. She told him about the time her father had tried to explain compound interest to her when she was 12, and how she had understood it immediately, and he had been startled by this, and had then looked proud in the way of fathers who have exceeded their own expectations. "He sounds like he was a good man," Joseph said. "He was a good man and a poor financial planner," Florence said. "I loved him very much, and I spent a great deal of energy compensating for his instincts in certain areas." "That is a very careful way of putting it. I am practicing," she said. "I used to be angrier about it. I am trying to find the version where I love him clearly without pretending he was better at things than he was." Joseph looked at her with an attention that was not clinical but was precise. "That is harder than it sounds," he said. "Much harder," she said. "It is easier to either sanctify the dead or use them to explain all your problems. And you are trying to do neither," he said. "I am trying," she said. "I have not fully succeeded." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think trying is the meaningful part." Outside the hotel after they stood in the cold January dark with their breath making small clouds and the stars over the desert brutal and bright the way they only are when the air is completely clear. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Thank you for asking," she said. There was a pause that had a shape to it, a specific geometry of possibility that both of them felt and neither rushed. "I would like to do this again," he said. "So would I," she said. He walked her to her wagon. He held the horse. She climbed up. She drove home, and this time she did not try to categorize the feeling. She simply let it be what it was. February brought a different kind of trouble. A man named Cole Whitmore rode into Millhaven with 3 companions, and the kind of history that preceded him like weather. Whitmore was wanted in Texas for fraud, and in Arizona for aggravated assault, and he had a talent for finding the gap between what a law officer could prove and what everyone understood to be true. He had apparently decided that Millhaven looked like a town with enough commercial activity to be profitable and enough frontier informality to be manageable. Within a week he had established himself at the saloon, had made introductions to several of the larger landholders in the area, and had floated the kind of investment proposals that sounded genuinely compelling until you looked at the details, which most people did not do because the general shape of the thing was appealing, and Cole Whitmore had Randall Coe's particular talent for making the general shape of things appear more solid than it was. Joseph noticed him immediately. He had a file that Garrett had received from the Texas Rangers the previous autumn, and Cole Whitmore's description matched it with a specificity that left no real doubt. He told Garrett, who agreed they needed to be careful, and the two of them began the process of verifying the identification through the formal channels that territorial law required before any action could be taken. Florence, meanwhile, was approached by Whitmore. He came to her ranch on a Tuesday morning in early February, arrived with a companion, rode in like a man who had been expected, introduced himself with the polished ease of a practiced performer, and made her a proposal. He was, he said, assembling a consortium of landholders interested in a combined water rights purchase from the territorial authority that would secure long-term grazing access for all involved. Her land sat at a strategic point in the water access network. Her participation would benefit the group and himself. He named a price for her joining that sounded reasonable. Florence listened to the entire pitch with her hands folded and her face neutral. When he finished, she said she would think about it and give him an answer within the week. He rode away and she went inside and stood at her kitchen table for 5 minutes thinking about the specific texture of his delivery, which had been very smooth and had contained all the right words in exactly the right order. She drove to Millhaven that afternoon. Joseph was at the desk. She sat down across from him without preamble and said, "A man named Cole Whitmore came to my ranch this morning." Something happened in Joseph's face. Not dramatic, not theatrical, but definitive. A sharpening of attention that told her everything she needed to know before he said a word. "Tell me exactly what he said," Joseph said. She told him. All of it, every detail, the phrasing, the companion who had stayed at the gate, the particular framing of the investment opportunity. When she finished, Joseph said, "Do not agree to anything. Do not tell him no, not yet. Just say you are still considering." "Why not no?" she said. "Because if he knows you are not a viable target, he will move to someone else. I need another 10 days to complete the verification and have grounds for an arrest. Every day he is still operating in Millhaven and still believes Millhaven is going to produce results is a day he stays in one place." Florence looked at him. "You are using my situation to keep him stationary." "I am asking you to help keep him stationary," he said. "That is different. You have a choice." She appreciated the distinction. "What risk does this put me in?" "If you are cautious, not much. You are not agreeing to anything. You are being appropriately hesitant in the way of a sensible person evaluating an investment. That is not unusual behavior. And if something goes wrong, then I handle it before it reaches you," he said, and this was the first thing he said to her that was something approaching a promise, and he said it with a flatness that was more convincing than any theatrical oath would have been. "All right," Florence said, 10 days. "Thank you," he said. She stood to go. At the door she paused. "Joseph," he looked up. "Be careful," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "I am always careful," he said. The 10 days were tense in the particular way of situations where most of the action is invisible and the surface remains calm by design. Florence received a second visit from Cole Whitmore's companion, a man who delivered a politely worded follow-up inquiry about her decision. She said she was nearly decided and would have an answer by the following Tuesday. Joseph's verification came back on the 9th day. The confirmation from the Texas Rangers was definitive. On the 10th day, Sheriff Garrett and Joseph arrested Cole Whitmore at the saloon with a precision that gave Whitmore's companions no useful opportunity to intervene. The charges were multiple. His companions, who turned out to have their own warrant history, were taken in simultaneously. Florence heard about it from Mrs. Albrecht, who heard about it from the general store proprietor, which was the normal information distribution mechanism in Millhaven, and she drove into town not because she needed to, but because she wanted to see for herself that it had gone correctly. Joseph was in the office writing his report when she arrived. He looked up. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who has been concentrating at high intensity for 10 consecutive days, but also settled, the way you look when a thing that needed doing has been done. "It went well," he said, answering the question she had not asked. "I could tell," she said. "You look like it went well." "Do I?" "You look like a man who did a difficult thing correctly," she said. Something in his face shifted in the way of a person who is not accustomed to being seen clearly and has not yet developed a defense against it. "Thank you for your help," he said. "I know it was not without cost." "The cost was manageable," she said. "You were right about that." She sat down across from his desk. "Tell me how it happened," she said. "I want to know," he told her. He told her about the verification process and the coordination with Garrett and the precise timing of the arrests, and the one moment where Whitmore had understood what was happening, and had made a calculation about whether to resist and had decided against it, which Joseph attributed to Whitmore being smart enough to do the math on his situation even in a crisis. Florence listened with her full attention. the way she always listened, and when he finished she said, "You plan for the alternatives. You have a contingency for every contingency." "I try to," he said. "It is not natural for most people," she said. "It is a discipline. It is a habit," he said. "I learned early that things do not go the way you imagine them going, and it is better to have thought about the other ways. Your mother the teacher and your father the cowboy," she said. "Something like that," he said. They sat in the afternoon light that came through the office window and fell across the desk in a broad, warm slant, and Florence thought about dark pasts and how they shape people and how Joseph Bancroft had been shaped into someone who planned carefully and kept every word he gave and never made a promise he had not measured against his actual capacity to deliver. "Joseph," she said. "Yes. I want to tell you something." He waited. He was good at waiting. "I think I have been in considerable difficulty for the past 14 months, she said. "Not just practical difficulty. The other kind. And I think I have been coming out of it slowly, and I think part of what has made that possible is you, specifically how you are, the way you do what you say and nothing more and nothing less. And I am telling you this because I believe you deserve to know it, and because I have decided that keeping useful information to myself when giving it would cost nothing is something I am done doing." He was very still for a moment. The afternoon light was across his hands on the desk, and his eyes were clear and deep, and looking at her with the full weight of his attention. "I think," he said, choosing his words with the deliberateness she had come to recognize as his form of care, "that you are the most capable person I have met in this territory. And I think that capability has been used against you, because capable people are easier to exploit than anyone admits, because the people who exploit them count on them to manage whatever situation is created. And I think that watching you use that capability for yourself, on your own terms, has been one of the better things I have witnessed in some years." Florence breathed. "That was a great deal of words from you," she said. "I had been keeping them," he said. She smiled. It was slow and warm and entirely genuine, and he looked at it like a man looking at something he had not allowed himself to expect. "Have supper with me again," she said. "On Friday." "Yes," he said. March came in on the warm side, which in New Mexico means the cold retreats to the mountains, and the desert floor warms enough to make afternoons comfortable, and evenings merely cool rather than brutal. Florence had 3 new calves, including the one she had saved in January, who was now healthy and stubborn, and had developed a personality that she found privately amusing. The banknote situation was stable following the Marsh agreement, and a second income stream she had established through a small arrangement with the Millhaven General Store to supply eggs from a flock of chickens she had expanded the previous autumn. She and Joseph had supper at the hotel dining room on 6 Fridays in March and April. They had also walked together twice along the main street of Millhaven in the early evening, which is a different thing from supper at the hotel, and was observed by the town with the particular attention that small communities give to the unfolding of romantic situations. Mrs. Albrecht told Florence that she thought they made a very sensible match, which was the highest compliment Mrs. Albrecht gave to anything. Sheriff Garrett told Joseph that it was about time he showed some personal interest in something other than warrants and property surveys. Joseph received this with the equanimity of a man who has no strong objection to being observed as long as no one is being imprecise about what they are observing. The conversation that changed the specific nature of things happened in April on a Tuesday, not Friday, because Florence had come into town for something practical and stayed longer than intended, and when the evening came on, she was still in Joseph's company, sitting on the bench outside the sheriff's office in the cooling air with the sunset doing something extraordinary to the western sky in the way of New Mexico sunsets that seemed designed to be excessive. "I am afraid of something," Florence said. "Tell me," Joseph said. "I am afraid that I am choosing you, at least in part, because you are different from Randall Coe," she said. And I'm afraid that choosing someone because they are the opposite of a previous bad choice is not actually choosing them for who they are. It is just reacting." Joseph considered this for a long, serious moment. "That is a legitimate concern," he said. "I know," she said. "The way to test it," he said carefully, "is to ask yourself whether you would value what I am, specifically, if Randall Coe had never existed. Whether the things that matter to you about how I am would matter regardless of the context." Florence was quiet for a long time. The sunset deepened and turned from gold to something almost red. "Yes," she said, "I think I would. I think the things I value about you are things I would always value. The precision, the honesty, the way you never make a performance of being good, you just are quietly where no one asks for it. That is not the opposite of Randall, that is just who you are." Joseph was looking at the sunset. His profile was very still. "I have been myself afraid of something," he said. "Tell me," she said, returning his own words to him. "I have been afraid that what I feel for you is entangled with wanting to protect you," he said. "That it is too caught up in the circumstances, the debt, the boundary trouble, Whitmore. That I am drawn to the situation and have confused that with being drawn to you." And she said, "And I looked at that honestly," he said. "And what I found is that what I feel about you has nothing to do with the circumstances. The circumstances are interesting to me because you are in them. You specifically, the way you think, the way you ask questions, the way you laughed at the Christmas gathering and were surprised by your own laugh, the way you brought lunch on the survey day without making any of us feel obligated to acknowledge it. You are who I am drawn to. The rest is just the setting." Florence turned to look at him fully in the last of the red light. "That was more words again," she said softly. "I had been keeping those too," he said. She reached across the space between them on the bench and put her hand over his where it rested on his knee. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat that way while the desert went purple, and the first stars appeared and Millhaven settled into its evening sounds, and neither of them said anything else because nothing else needed saying. Spring deepened into early summer, and the relationship between Florence and Joseph deepened with it in the way of things built on honest foundations, which is steadily and without dramatic crisis, each layer added with the kind of care that makes things permanent. He came to her ranch for the first time on a Saturday morning in May, ostensibly to help with the fence repair on the north boundary that she had mentioned needing to complete before the summer grazing season. He came with tools, and he worked alongside her with the uncomplaining competence of a man who has done physical labor and does not need to demonstrate anything about himself through it. They fixed 40 feet of fence in the morning and ate lunch on the porch and talked about things both serious and easy, ranging from territorial politics to the novel they had both reread over the winter to the naming of the stubborn January calf, which Florence had, she admitted, privately been calling Survivor, which Joseph thought was both practical and slightly sentimental, which he said as a compliment. He began to come on Saturdays regularly. Sometimes there was work to do. Sometimes there was not particular work, and they simply occupied the same space, which had its own particular comfort. He sat at her kitchen table and she sat at her kitchen table, and they were each doing their own things, reading or writing or working through the ranch accounts, and the simple domesticity of two people being quietly productive in each other's company was something Florence had not known she needed until she had it. In June, Joseph arrived one Saturday morning with a small cactus in a clay pot. He set it on her porch railing without explanation. Florence looked at it for a moment. "What is this?" she said. "The post office had a delivery for the Delacroix farm," he said. "The package included seeds and a few established plants. Mrs. Delacroix does not care for cactus. She was going to dispose of it. I thought you might prefer it to the alternative." "You saved a cactus," Florence said. "It seemed like a shame," he said. Florence looked at the cactus, which was small and green and healthy, and she thought, in an entirely irrational way, representative of everything she had come to understand about Joseph Bancroft, which is that he moved through the world saving small things without announcing that he was doing it, and without any expectation that the saving would be attributed to him. "I love you," she said. She had not planned to say it. It came out with the directness of something she had known for some time and had simply not yet arranged into words. He was still for a moment. Then he turned from looking at the cactus to looking at her. "I love you," he said. "I have been trying to find the right moment to say it." "There is not a right moment," she said. "There is just the moment." "That is very practical," he said. "I have been learning from someone," she said. He stepped toward her, and she stepped toward him, and he put his hands on her face with a gentleness that was entirely consistent with everything else about him, careful and sure and entirely present, and kissed her for the first time in the warm June morning on her porch with the cactus on the railing and Survivor the calf calling from the pasture below. And it was the kind of kiss that does not need to be dramatic, because it has the full weight of everything that led to it behind it. They stood on the porch for a long time after, his arms around her and her face against his shoulder, looking out at the land she had fought for and saved and planned for and would continue to build. And she felt the specific wholeness of a person who has arrived at something they did not know to hope for but recognizes completely when it comes. Summer in 1883 was good to the territory in the way that good years are good, which is not through the absence of difficulty, but through the presence of enough abundance and stability that difficulty can be managed rather than endured. Florence's herd grew. The marsh water lease renewed. The banknote reduced incrementally but definitively. Joseph made a proposal in July. He did it the way he did everything, which was directly and without theater. He came to her ranch on a Saturday morning, sat across from her at the kitchen table and said, "I would like to marry you. I think we would be well suited for a life together. I think you already know most of what I am, and I already know most of what you are. And I believe that what we are together is better than what either of us is separately, not because we complete each other in some sentimental sense, but because we are actually useful to each other, and we are actually happy in each other's company, which I think is the more durable thing." Florence looked at him across her kitchen table with the morning light coming in through the new windows she had put in that spring. "Yes," she said, "all of that is true, and yes." He reached into his vest pocket and set a ring on the table between them. It was simple, a small garnet set in gold, not elaborate, not performative. It was the ring of someone who had thought about what she would actually want rather than what would look most like a proposal. She picked it up and put it on and held her hand out to look at it. "It fits," she said. "I asked Mrs. Albrecht," he said. "You borrowed her thimble last spring for a sewing project and she kept the size in mind." Florence stared at him. "You asked Mrs. Albrecht for my ring size," she said. "2 months ago," he said, "when I was reasonably certain but before I was ready to ask." The specific preparation of that act, the thinking ahead, the quiet arranging of small details months before they were needed, was so perfectly characteristic of him that she felt something give way in her chest in the best possible way. "Joseph Bancroft," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are the most remarkably understated person I have ever encountered in my entire life." "I prefer to be accurate," he said, and she laughed, the real laugh again, the one that surprised her, and he smiled in the way she had learned to look for, the one that started in his eyes before it reached his mouth. They were married in September of 1883 in Millhaven's small church on a morning that started cool and warmed as the ceremony progressed, which Florence took as a favorable sign from the natural world, even though she was not particularly given to reading the weather for metaphors. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher, who happened to be in town on his regular schedule, and who was a man of enough experience with frontier marriages to understand that this one had a different texture from most, something quieter and more certain than the nervous excitement of young romance. Mrs. Albrecht cried. Sheriff Garrett shook Joseph's hand for longer than was strictly necessary. Tom Ray's sent a letter of congratulations that arrived 2 days before the wedding, and was therefore read at the celebration dinner that followed. Florence wore her mother's dress altered to fit, with a ribbon she had chosen herself in a particular shade of blue that Joseph had said, when she had shown him 3 ribbon options the previous week, was the one that suited her. He had not said it was the prettiest or the most fashionable. He had said it suited her, which was the right thing. He said his vows in a clear and even voice, each word placed with care. When it was her turn, she said hers, looking directly at him, because the vows were for him, and she wanted him to know she understood that. They went home to her ranch, which was now their ranch, and began their life together with the uncomplicated purposefulness of 2 people who have already established how they work together, and simply now have the full span of their days to continue doing it. The autumn of their first year of marriage was productive and contented. Joseph negotiated with Sheriff Garrett to continue his deputy work on a modified schedule that allowed him more time at the ranch, which Garrett agreed to partly because Joseph had earned significant latitude through 2 years of excellent service, and partly because Garrett was an observant man who could see that Joseph Bancroft had arrived at the specific happiness that makes a person want to remain exactly where they are. Florence expanded the chicken operation and established a small contract with a hotel in the next town to supply eggs. Joseph proved himself a considerable asset on the ranch because he approached cattle the way he approached everything, methodically and without wasted effort, and because he had the patience to do unglamorous maintenance work without either complaint or the need to be praised for it. They talked every evening. This was, Florence thought, the thing she had not known to want most, a person at the end of the day who was genuinely interested in what the day had contained. Joseph asked questions and listened to the answers and remembered what she told him, which she had come to understand was his form of affection, the active retention of everything she said, the ongoing record he kept of who she was. She did the same for him. She listened to his accounts of the town, the small matters of law and order that made up the fabric of the community, and she asked the clarifying questions that let her understand not just the facts but the way he thought about them. And she found that the way he thought about things was one of the things she loved most specifically. Spring of 1884 brought a change that Florence discovered on a morning in late March and spent one private day processing before telling Joseph. She was expecting their child. She told him that evening at the kitchen table. She watched his face and saw in it something she had not seen before, a quality of profound and settled joy, the kind that does not express itself as excitement but as a deep internal rearrangement, as if everything had shifted slightly to accommodate a new truth. When? He said, October, she said. November at the latest. I will know better in another few weeks. He reached across the table and took her hand. He held it without speaking for a long moment. I am going to be good at this, he said, not as a boast, but as a statement of intention, the kind he made only about things he had already measured himself against. I am going to be good at it the way my father was good at it, which is by being present and consistent and never making you feel that the ordinary days are not enough. Florence held his hand tightly. You already do that, she said. You have been doing that. Then I know I can keep doing it, he said. Their son was born on the 28th of October, 1884, in the bedroom of the ranch house, attended by the Millhaven doctor and Mrs. Albrecht, who had appointed herself Florence's primary support person for the event, and executed this role with calm and effective authority. The labor was long but uncomplicated in the medical sense, and the boy arrived as the afternoon turned toward evening, a healthy child with a loud opinion about the transition he had just made. Joseph was outside the bedroom for the entirety of the labor, which was the custom, but his presence was perceptible through the door, quiet and steady, available. When they let him in and he held his son for the first time, Florence watched his face from the pillow where exhaustion had pinned her and felt a love so large it seemed like it should have some visible physical dimension. What do you want to name him? She said. I have been thinking, he said, looking at the baby with the focused attention he gave to things that mattered. Gerald for your father, and Thomas for Tom Rays, who helped us when it mattered. Gerald Thomas Bancroft, if you agree. Florence's throat tightened. "Gerald Thomas," she said. "Yes, I agree." "He looks skeptical," Joseph said, studying the baby. "He has been relocated without being consulted," Florence said. "He has a right to an opinion." Joseph smiled the slow smile and looked at her over the head of their son, and the love between them in that moment was so complete it required no words, which was fortunate, because Joseph had never been comfortable with words he could not make exact, and there was nothing exact to say to something this large. He simply held the baby and looked at his wife, and the whole world was that room. The years that followed were full in the way of lives well constructed, not without difficulty, but with the kind of difficulty that is manageable because the foundation under it is solid. The ranch grew steadily under their combined management. Florence's vision and organizational intelligence paired with Joseph's methodical patience, and his talent for anticipating problems before they became crises. Gerald Thomas, who became simply Thomas by his second year because he had a decided personality that somehow suited the shorter name better, was a child of formidable curiosity and considerable stubbornness, who kept his parents occupied in ways that were usually charming and occasionally exhausting. He had Joseph's steady attention span and Florence's habit of asking questions that required actual thinking to answer, and the combination produced a child who at 3 years old could sit quietly through an entire conversation between adults and then ask a follow-up question that demonstrated he had been listening to all of it. Joseph resigned his deputy position in the spring of 1886. Sheriff Garrett was retiring, and his successor, a young man brought in from Santa Fe, was competent but had a different approach to the work, faster and more confrontational than Joseph's patient methodology. Joseph worked with the transition for 3 months, then came home one evening and said, without particular drama, that he thought his time in the position had run its natural course, and that the ranch needed his full attention in ways that made the dual role increasingly impractical. Florence asked him if he was certain. He said he was. She trusted his certainty because he had demonstrated across 4 years that he did not claim certainty he did not have. He brought his full attention to the ranch, and within 1 season the difference was measurable in the accounts. Their daughter, Clara Jane Bancroft, arrived in August of 1887, unplanned and completely welcome. She was a child of different temperament from Thomas, quieter in her observation and more forthcoming in her affection, and she had Joseph's steady brown eyes and Florence's particular laugh, the real one, the surprised one, which she deployed with less self-consciousness than her mother had always managed. Florence sat on the porch in the late summer of 1887, with Clara Jane on her lap and Thomas, attempting to build something architectural with sticks near the porch steps, and Joseph coming up from the south pasture in the long evening light, his figure tall and steady and familiar, and she thought about the sequence of things that had brought her here. She thought about Gerald Hawthorne and the debt he had left her, and the fever that had taken him too early, and the way his death had cracked her life open in directions she had not been able to anticipate. She thought about Randall Coe and the 14 months of waiting and the specific texture of the betrayal, which had been so complete it had ultimately been clarifying. She thought about the envelope hitting the floor of the sheriff's office and the coffee cup appearing on the edge of the desk without ceremony. She thought about promises. She thought about the ranchers and businessmen and neighbors who had surrounded her in the year of her hardest difficulty, all of them offering things they did not deliver, all of them speaking in the confident language of men, accustomed to having their words taken at face value regardless of their record of follow-through. She thought about how she had been trained by culture and circumstance to weight big promises heavily and to barely register small actions, and how that training had nearly cost her everything. And she thought about Joseph, who had never made her a large promise in his life, who had poured coffee and written down names and called a surveyor and kept vigil outside a bedroom door and named a son after her father and planted a cactus on the porch railing, who had said "I love you" when it was true and "I will" when he was certain, and nothing when he had nothing certain to say. Joseph reached the porch and came up the steps and leaned down to kiss her, and then looked at Clara Jane with a serious expression. "She appears to have mud on her left foot," he said. "She appears to have mud on both feet," Florence said. "She has been conducting an experiment." "What kind of experiment?" Joseph said, sitting down in the chair beside her. "Empirical," Florence said. "She wanted to determine whether the mud by the water trough was the same consistency as the mud by the garden. She is thorough." "She is your daughter," Joseph said. "She has your eyes," Florence said. "She has your methods," he said. They sat in the evening, and Thomas's architectural endeavor collapsed with a crash of sticks, and he considered it with his father's focused attention and began rebuilding, and Clara Jane put both muddy feet on the porch railing to examine them, and the sunset did its New Mexico thing with the western sky, and Florence leaned her head against Joseph's shoulder. "I was thinking about the beginning today," she said. "Of what?" he said. "Of us," she said. "Of how it started. I was standing in Garrett's office with that letter, and I was as close to truly undone as I have ever been, and you poured me a cup of coffee." "The coffee was terrible," he said. "It had been on the stove since morning." "It was the most important cup of coffee in my life," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I saw you come in that morning, and I thought, this person is carrying something very heavy, and no one around her is going to do anything useful about it. And I thought, well, the coffee is available." "That is the most romantic story I have ever heard," Florence said. "It is not romantic," he said. "It is entirely romantic," she said. "It is just that it is romance without performance, which is the only kind worth having." He put his arm around her, and she settled into the familiar weight of his side, and the children moved around the porch in the evening light, and somewhere in the south pasture Survivor, now a large and thoroughly unimpressed steer, issued his opinion about the coming dark. The territory was changing. The railroad had come through 2 counties over and was changing the economics of ranching in ways that required adaptation. Florence and Joseph had discussions that lasted through multiple evenings about the best path forward, whether to expand the herd to take advantage of new access to eastern markets, or to diversify into different agricultural lines that might prove more stable over time. These were genuine strategic discussions between 2 people who each brought different but complementary kinds of intelligence to a shared problem, and they did not always agree immediately, but they worked through disagreement the way they worked through everything, with patience and an underlying respect for what the other person saw that they themselves might be missing. They expanded the herd modestly and diversified into hay production, which proved to be a sound combination. The hay operation, which Joseph had researched carefully before proposing it, provided stable income through the dry years when cattle prices dropped. In 1889, New Mexico Territory began its move toward statehood, which did not arrive for another 2 decades but generated considerable political activity in the interim. Joseph, whose precision with language and whose methodical understanding of law and property rights had not gone unnoticed in Millhaven and the surrounding county, was asked by a coalition of landholders and community members to serve on a county advisory board that was being assembled to formalize the representation of smaller landholders in the discussions about territorial governance. He agreed after discussing it with Florence, who told him she thought it was exactly the right use of what he was good at, and that she could manage the ranch with the help they had established over the years, and that he should do it. He served on the board for 3 years and proved to be exactly what he had always been, the person in the room who had read everything and remembered it, and said the precise thing at the precise moment without any interest in being credited for it, which meant his influence on outcomes was often considerable and almost never attributed correctly. Florence joined him for several of the public meetings where landholders were invited to give testimony about their concerns, and she gave testimony on 2 occasions that was notable for its clarity and specificity, and its complete refusal to reduce complex issues to simple rhetoric, which was a quality in short supply at most of these proceedings. Thomas grew into the kind of boy who would clearly become the kind of man you could rely on absolutely, quiet and thorough in the way of his father, with an additional streak of warmth and humor that was all his own. By the time he was 8, he was doing genuine work on the ranch with the focused competence of a child who has been taught that tasks have standards and that meeting them is its own satisfaction. Clara Jane was different and complementary, more socially gifted than either of her parents in the easy, natural way of people who find other people genuinely interesting, with an intelligence that expressed itself through conversation and a memory for everything anyone had ever told her about themselves that made her the person everyone in Millhaven wanted to talk to by the time she was 6. Christmases at the Bancroft Ranch became the gathering that people remembered, the one where Florence cooked too much, and Joseph kept the fire exactly right, and Thomas organized the younger children of guests into games that were structured enough to prevent chaos and loose enough to remain fun, and Clara Jane sat with the adults and asked the kind of questions that produced actual conversation, and the house was full in the specific way of homes that have been built to be full. The cactus that Joseph had brought from the post office had grown by 1890 into something that required its own section of the porch railing, having been transplanted twice into progressively larger containers. Florence tended it with the same care she brought to everything living on the ranch, and Joseph observed this without comment, but occasionally she caught him looking at it with an expression that she understood to be a form of private satisfaction. In the winter of 1891, Florence walked into the sheriff's office on an errand related to a minor grazing license renewal, and the young deputy behind the desk, a new man from Las Cruces who had been in the position for 6 months, offered her the kind of brisk, impersonal assistance that was professionally adequate and entirely devoid of any particular attention. She thanked him, took her paperwork, and walked back to her wagon. She sat in the wagon seat for a moment in the cold, clear air and thought about an afternoon 9 years ago when she had stood in that same office with a letter that had ended something, and a man she barely knew had poured her a cup of terrible coffee and put it on the edge of the desk without making any of it about himself. She drove home to the ranch. Joseph was at the kitchen table going over the winter feed accounts. He looked up when she came in. "The license was renewed," he said. "Without incident," she said. She hung up her coat and sat across from him at the table and looked at him in the winter afternoon light that came through the windows she had put in years ago, and she thought that this was what a kept promise looked like when you accumulated enough of them across enough time. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just a man at a table with feed accounts and clear eyes and 8 years of small true things stacked up like stones in a well-built wall. "I love you," she said, because she still said it regularly and without ceremony, having learned that love expressed plainly is more sustaining than love saved for significant occasions. He looked up from the accounts and looked at her across the table. "I love you," he said, same plain certainty, same weight, the same as it had always been, which was the whole point. Thomas came in from outside a few minutes later with the particular controlled urgency of a 9-year-old who has something important to report and has decided to present it formally. He stood at the kitchen table and announced that Survivor had gotten through the south fence again and was currently expressing his views about the winter pasture in ways that required paternal expertise to manage. Joseph stood and got his coat. "He has been doing this every winter," Florence said. "He is consistent," Joseph said, which was the kind of observation she had come to recognize as his equivalent of affectionate resignation. "Like someone else I know," she said. He looked at her over his coat collar as he buttoned it, and the look he gave her was everything, contained and clear and without any unnecessary words around it. And she smiled at him in a way that had been getting easier for 9 years and was still surprising her with its ease. And then he went out with Thomas to deal with Survivor. And Clara Jane came in from the room where she had been drawing and climbed into Florence's lap without asking, because she never needed to ask. And Florence held her daughter in the kitchen that smelled of pine smoke and winter, and the dried apple cake she had made that morning. Outside, she could hear Joseph's voice and Thomas's voice, patient and specific, working the problem. The sounds of the ranch in winter. The sounds of a life that had been built carefully from a beginning that had seemed like an ending. By the spring of 1892, the Bancroft Ranch had become what Florence had once barely allowed herself to imagine: a functioning, stable operation with clear title to the land, no outstanding debt, and a reputation in the county for fair dealing and reliable product. The bank in Santa Fe had sent a form letter the previous autumn acknowledging the retirement of all obligations, and Florence had framed it and hung it in the kitchen, which was the only piece of wall decoration in the house that was not practical, and Joseph had looked at it the day she hung it and said nothing, but had put his hand briefly on her back in the way he had of marking the important moments with touch rather than words. Thomas was showing real aptitude for the management side of the operation, the accounts and the planning and the negotiations with buyers and suppliers, and Florence was already beginning to think about how to formalize his involvement as he grew into it. Clara Jane had announced at the age of 7.5 that she wanted to be a school teacher, which her grandmother Bancroft, who had received letters from Joseph about his children with the kind of regularity that his mother had told him was the very least she expected from a son, thought was entirely appropriate, and had sent Clara Jane 3 books in response. Florence's mother, who had been living with a sister in Albuquerque since Gerald Hawthorne's death, came to visit in the summer of 1892 and spent 2 weeks at the ranch, and she observed her daughter's life with the particular attention of a woman who has worried about someone for a long time and is assessing whether the worry was misplaced. On the last evening of her visit, she sat on the porch with Joseph while Florence was inside putting Clara Jane to bed, and she said to him, with the directness of a woman who had been patient enough and was done being indirect, "You are good to her." "I try to be," he said. "No," she said. "It is not trying. It is what you are. I have been watching you for 2 weeks and you are not performing goodness. You are just good." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the land in the evening dark. "She makes it easy," he said. "She is a person worth being good to." "She has always been that," her mother said. "Not everyone saw it." "Their mistake," he said. Florence's mother looked at him for a long moment in the porch dark. Then she said, "Yes," and went inside, and it was the most complete conversation either of them needed on the subject. The last frontier towns of New Mexico Territory were changing in 1892, slowly taking on the texture of places with permanence rather than places with ambition. Millhaven had a proper school now, a brick building put up in 1890 with 2 rooms and a permanent teacher, a young woman named Miss Patterson from Ohio, who had come west with a degree, and a conviction that frontier children deserved the same quality of education as any other children, which they did, and which she provided with considerable effectiveness. Clara Jane Bancroft was one of her best students, and Miss Patterson told Florence at a school function that winter that Clara Jane had an exceptional gift for language and a quality of empathy that made her unusually effective at helping other children understand things, which was, Miss Patterson said, the foundation of a teacher's skill. Florence told Joseph that evening. He received the information with the quiet satisfaction of a man hearing something about his daughter that confirms what he already knew. "She has always known how to read a room," he said. "She gets it from you," Florence said. "I read rooms," he said. "She makes people feel welcome in them. That is different and more impressive." "She gets that from you too," Florence said, "whether you want credit for it or not." He let this go without argument, which was itself characteristic. The years continued to accumulate in the way of good years, not perfectly, not without their ordinary griefs and frustrations and adjustments, but with the kind of underlying continuity that comes from having built something on honest materials. The territory moved toward statehood by its slow and complicated route. The railroad reshaped the regional economy in ways that required ongoing adaptation. Drought years and wet years alternated in the unpredictable rhythm of the southwestern climate, and the Bancroft Ranch navigated each through the combination of Florence's adaptive intelligence and Joseph's systematic preparation. Thomas married at 22, a measured and thoughtful young man who chose with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, a woman named Ruth from a neighboring family who was serious and kind, and who understood, having spent considerable time at the Bancroft table over the course of 3 years of courtship, exactly what kind of family she was joining. Florence welcomed her with the specific warmth of a woman who has been waiting to expand the table without reducing what was already at it. Joseph treated her as a full member of the family from the first day forward, which was not a decision he announced but a posture he simply assumed, and Ruth felt it immediately and was grateful for it in the particular way of people who have been uncertain what their welcome would be. Clara Jane, true to her 8-year-old self's announcement, completed her education and returned to Millhaven to teach at the school where she had been a student, taking over when Miss Patterson married a rancher from the eastern county and relocated. She was, by all accounts and her mother's unbiased assessment, exceptional at the work. Florence stood on her porch in the autumn of 1906 and looked at her land in the late light. She was 51 years old and she had no pain to speak of, and a clear mind, and a ranch that was producing well and children who were good people and grandchildren who were coming into their own. She had her mother's ring on one hand and Joseph's garnet ring on the other, and a life that had been built from a beginning so uncertain, she still sometimes marveled that she had navigated it. Joseph came and stood beside her. He was 53 and gray at the temples and entirely himself, the same quality of stillness, the same clear brown eyes. "Tom and Ruth are coming for supper on Sunday," she said. "I know," he said. "She mentioned the new baby might arrive before Sunday." "The doctor said another 2 weeks at least," Florence said. "Doctors have said at least 2 weeks before," he said. Florence smiled. Their first grandchild, Thomas's eldest, had arrived with considerable disregard for the doctor's timeline, appearing 10 days ahead of schedule with the confident punctuality of a person who had somewhere to be. The second had been more accommodating. The third, who was Thomas's, was apparently undecided. "What do you want?" she said. "Boy or girl?" "I do not have a preference," he said. "I just want everyone safe through it." "That is the right answer," she said. "It is also the honest answer," he said. She took his hand. The evening was cool and the land was going to gold and purple in the way of autumn evenings in the high desert, and the sound of the ranch in the early evening was the sound she had lived inside for most of her adult life and still found, every time, an active comfort. "I have been thinking about the beginning again," she said. She said this periodically, and he had learned it was not nostalgia exactly, or not only nostalgia but a kind of taking stock, a return to the original terms to verify that the account still balanced. "What part?" he said. "The coffee," she said. "The first thing. I think about it sometimes, and I think about how it seemed so small, and yet, he agreed. "Every rancher in this territory had something to offer me that autumn," she said. "Every man with land and cattle came around with promises, big ones, grand ones, fixed everything in theory. None of them delivered on any of it. Some of them tried," he said, because he was fair about these things. "Some of them tried," she conceded. "But even the trying was weighted toward what they needed the situation to be, not what I needed it to be." He was quiet, listening. "You never promised me anything you couldn't deliver," she said. "You gave me coffee and a list of names and a surveyor and information about a criminal and a ring in the right size and a name for our son. Every small thing, all of it kept." He looked out at the land. "I do not know how to be the other way," he said. "The large promise way. It has always seemed to me like building a house and calling it finished before you know whether the foundation is solid." "That is precisely it," she said. "That is exactly the thing." They stood together in the evening, and the land spread out before them, and behind them was the house they had made into what they needed it to be, and inside it was everything they had built. And Florence thought that this was what keeping small promises across many years actually produced, which was not small things at all, but the largest thing imaginable, which was a life. Joseph turned and looked at her with his full attention, the way he had always looked at her when he wanted her to understand that she had his complete and undivided regard. "I am glad it was your office," she said. "I am glad I was the one who came in with that letter." "So am I," he said. "Every day." She leaned into him, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood on the porch of the ranch that had been her father's, and then hers, and then theirs. In the New Mexico autumn, in the last years of the territorial period, before statehood would come and change the place again. And the cactus on the railing, now substantial and ancient in cactus terms, stood in its final and largest container against the evening sky, and the land was everything it had always been. Honest and difficult and beautiful and entirely worth the tending. Ruth and Thomas arrived on Friday rather than Sunday, and the new baby arrived on Saturday morning, a boy, as healthy and loud as his two older siblings, and he was named for Joseph's father, which was Thomas's idea, and which Joseph received with the kind of quietness that was his fullest expression of feeling moved. And on Sunday they were all at the table, and the table was full, and Florence made the coffee and brought it out the way she always did, and when she set the cup in front of Joseph, he looked up at her with everything they had ever been to each other in that look, and she smiled at him with her full real smile, the surprised one, still surprised after 23 years, and he smiled back with the slow, warm, beginning in the eyes smile, and it was everything, all of it. Every small true thing kept across every day of every year, and it was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.